Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out. We're so happy to have you here tonight. It's a pretty warm day. Luckily, it's not smoky, which is good. I'm so pleased to be able to share a little bit of the wonderful research that we do here at Sedgwick. Tonight's particularly salient with the Gifford Fire about 15 miles away. We're very lucky there hasn't been any movement on the south end, and also grateful for the efforts of the firefighters on the north and west end particularly. So as you probably know, this community was affected by the lake fire about a year ago. And of the 6,000 acres that are Sedgwick, about half of that burned. But of the part that burned, mostly the north section, half of that was backfiring. So that's intentional fire that was put on the ground to protect our resources, and they use the roads as a fire break. So we're at Sedgwick, we're familiar with intentional fire, with prescribed burning, which is another tool. And we use that for our vegetation management plan that we developed with the Santa Barbara County Fire Department. That took almost over a decade of a lot of hard work and administration to put into place. But the benefits have been amazing. We intended to use it to reduce fuel loads and create some research opportunities, but there's also been a lot of training opportunities, workforce expansion to get more people who know how to do prescribed fire. Cultural stewardship, there's a lot of indigenous groups that we've worked with, and not to mention all of the research that's been put in there. So every data point Shane or anybody else gets is like a really hard one, and it's on the work of like hundreds of people. But another great benefit has been community building. The number of people that come together for these fires and for these events, and the people who are curious about it and support it. Last year was over 50 different agencies, universities, land conservancies, and indigenous groups that helped us do the fire in the southwest corner. So it's just been absolutely amazing. And it gives us opportunities like this to come together on a nice summer evening, to meet each other, to exchange information, and learn about some really cool science. So I appreciate you guys coming out. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Evans.
Great, thanks, Heather. So hi everyone, I'm Nikki Evans. I'm the Outreach and Communications Specialist here. From me from time to time. So we have some folks who are new to Sedgwick Reserve. So I just wanted to tell you briefly what this place is. So we are part of the University of California's Natural Reserve System. And we're one of 7 reserves that are owned by UCSD and one of 42 reserves across the entire system. And we have a 3-part mission. It's research, teaching, and public service. And so you're going to hear about some of the research that's going on here. We're really fortunate to have Dr. Shane Reese here today to talk with us. And that's a big part of what we do, is to have these lands conserved where folks can have research that they know is not going to get disturbed, including long-term research plots. That's a really important part of Field Station. We have teaching and education. So students come out here, a lot of undergrad classes, sometimes for their first time, camping or learning about field work. We have K-12 programs, mostly through nature track, that come out. And then we have public service, which is our public programs. So things like this, having lectures, we have hikes. And when the weather cools down a bit, we'll resume our second Saturday public hike program. And so if you're not on our newsletter, go ahead and get on there, and that'll give you updates on that and other programs as they come up throughout the year as well. So I'd like to introduce our speakers. So Dr. Shane Deweese is assistant project scientist with ERI, and he graduated from UCSD and Carla D'Antonio's Vegetation Ecology Group Lab at the University of California. And Shane started as an undergrad assistant, moved to lab technician, to lab manager, to graduate student, to doctor. So really has been with this research for quite some time. His research aims to use plant physiology as a lens to understand the mechanistic underpinnings of the ecological phenomena observed in research. And he focuses broadly on drivers of vegetation fluxes in Southern California, kind of chaparral restoration ecology, and of course, oak woodland fire ecology, which is something we'll learn and hear about tonight. He also aims for his research to have an applied aspect and works closely with researchers and managers to help inform decisions. So we love seeing projects like this that can also help to inform management of places like Sedgwick Reserve. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Shane Roots.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for coming out on your Friday evening to spend some time listening to me talk. I'm really excited to be here, and thanks to both Heather and Nikki for that introduction. I think Heather set up really nicely. One of the topics I'm going to really focus on today is this concept of good fire. And so explaining some of the benefits that fire can have in our community is really important. And so with that, I'm going to dive in, and my goal today is to tell a story that really talks about the history of human-started fires throughout California and have the takeaway be that there are ecological and community benefits, but we're living in a changing world. And so understanding how changing conditions might affect that is really important in applying it on a broad scale. And so just a quick outline of where my talk's going to go today. I'm going to start with the history of human-started fires in California. It's a really deep and rich history, which will naturally lead into the current wildfire problem that we face in the state. And then from there, narrow into the specific system that we're in today and that I'll be talking about of the current conditions in Southern California oak woodlands, which will then allow me to share some research I've been doing that tries to help define what good fire might look like in these systems. And then I'll wrap up with just a few key takeaways that I hope you got out of this talk. And so with that, first, I want to thank my collaborators, Frank Davis, Max Moritz, Leander Anderegg, and then two amazing undergraduates, Brooke Ryan and Olivia Craig, who've helped out on this project, and then the Sedgwick Reserve and staff, who without their help, I wouldn't be able to be out here doing this work and have helped with all the logistics about the fire and just daily visits. The Nature Conservancy, Santa Barbara County Fire, and all of the TREX participants who made the fire I'll be talking about today and this research took place on possible. All my colleagues in both the D'Antonio Lab and Leaf Lab who've supported me through all my work, the many people who've helped me in the field, and then the generous funding support from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, who have funded this work over the last 3 years and made all the work that I'll be showing today possible, and have recently just provided some supplemental funding to allow us to continue this work for another 3 years. And then I want to acknowledge that we're on the unceded land of the Chumash tribe. And I think this is an important thing to start with, not only because of the ethical considerations, but it's really where the story I want to tell begins. The history of fire in California, of human-started fire, starts with the Chumash and the other countless native tribes that exist in California. And if we look at a timeline of human-started fires, we can see that this history starts about 12,000 years ago, when it's estimated that humans first migrated to California and settled it. And with that, they brought the knowledge and the skills to use fire for a variety of personal reasons. And so we know that indigenous fire was widespread throughout California during this era. It's estimated that between 5.7 and 12.4 million acres were burned every year due to both lightning-started fires and indigenous fires, which is about 6 to 16% of California landmass minus the southern deserts. So a wide amount of California was burning at a yearly basis, and largely due to the constant, frequent, both small and large-scale burning by these indigenous people. And we know that they use fire for a variety of reasons. They used it to help hunt, both to promote forage material of deers to increase their populations where they wanted to hunt them, and then also more actively to using techniques like ring firing, where they would light a circle around prey to contain them and make them easier to hunt, or driving prey to natural barriers like rivers or cliffs. They also use fire to help keep the country open. They would clear out dense shrublands or forests to more easy to access meadows in order to establish settlements, and then also to establish trails for them to traverse the landscape. Anyone here who's tried to hike through Chaparral knows it's quite challenging to get through. And so in addition to using bear trails, they would use fire to open up pathways for them to travel, which made it not only easier, but also safer so that dangerous snakes or tribes they were in conflict with couldn't hide and attack them. They also use it for a variety of their basketry and other cultural crafts. We know that tree and shrub resprouts that come after fire are much more desirable for weaving or making arrows. They grow straighter, they're more flexible, and so they're easier to work with. In addition, different herbaceous plants like deer grass and elephant grass, where they use the flower stalks in order to weave, It's been shown that the fires that indigenous folks used in this era would promote more dense flowerings, and so there'd be more material for them to collect and work with. They also used fire to enhance food production. A lot of the food and medicinal plants that they used are fire followers that either have higher abundance or only follow after a fire. In addition, acorns, which are a keystone diet to indigenous people, have been shown to sometimes increase in production after fire. So they would use this to increase their access to food. And then lastly, there's evidence they also use it to combat insects and diseases in these um, high value plants. For example, oak acorns are sometimes eaten by weevils, making them unviable and lower food quality. But it's been shown that the heat and smoke from fire can actually reduce the weevil count and lead to more viable and high quality food acorns. In addition to the personal uses that they were using fire for, it's also important to acknowledge that there are ecological effects to having this frequent and widespread fire on the landscape. Namely, it's thought that there were changes in distribution and diversity of plant populations in communities. And over the last few decades, with the removal of fire from the landscape, it's been shown that some communities that existed during the indigenous fire era were actually reliant on this consistent use of fire. And with the loss of fire on the landscape, they've actually been diminishing in size and we've been losing them. And so I really want you to keep in mind as we go through this talk that there is this ecological component, and any fire on the landscape can affect the vegetation and the animals on the landscape that we're working on. And so going back to this timeline, we can see that human-started fires was really abundant during this indigenous fire era. And that persisted until the 1500s with European colonization of the United States of North America. And with that, there were some largely indirect effects they had that reduced the amount of fire on the landscape. Namely, the introduction of different European diseases, which devastated the indigenous populations, led to much less fire happening on the landscape due to those reductions in population. And then these European colonizers also introduced non-native species, which spread throughout California and have had widespread effects on the fire regime and fire behavior, which I'll touch on more in a little bit. From there, as the California missions were established and the more indigenous people were enslaved and concentrated in small areas, that further removal of them from areas of the landscape led to a reduction of fire on the landscape. And this was most prevalent in areas like the coast, where there's very little lightning-induced fire. So much of the wildfire burning through these areas were started by indigenous peoples. And so by removing them and concentrating them, it led to a dramatic reduction in fire burning through these coastal areas of California. The next phase in this history of human-induced fires is the gold rush and statehood era, where people would use fire on smaller scales to clear land for grazing or gold mining and settling. Additionally, we know that sheep herders would use fires as they left an area to promote higher forage when they returned the following year. And there's also accidental ignitions during the development of the railroad system throughout the California and the United States. And suppression was relatively small and limited to just protecting settlements. And so there was still some fire occurring at the landscape, but at smaller scales. And so we can see during these 3 centuries, there's a gradual reduction in human-started fires across the landscape. And then in the 1900s, with the creation of the United States Forest Service, the first chair of the department created the first nationwide suppression policy, which led to dramatic decreases in fire on the landscape, where it was really driven by this philosophy that nature could be dominated and controlled by humans, and the role of forests in the United States was as timberland, and that they were underproducing due to the menace of wildfire. Then, after years of high-profile fires like the 1910 Idaho fire and the 1932 Berkeley fire, this suppression policy became even stronger with the enactment of the 10 a.m. policy, where the goal was whenever a fire was reported to put it out by 10 a.m. Failing that, then put it out by the following 10 a.m. period. That, in combination with the first national education campaign around fire prevention, which eventually merged into what we now know as the Smokey the Bear campaign, only you can stop forest fires, led to even more effectiveness of eliminating wildfire from the landscape. And then with technologies that emerged from World War II, like aerial support, fire retardant, and bulldozers, we became incredibly effective at suppressing fires, stopping them from spreading, and really removing fire from the landscape. This continued as the status quo until the late 60s, where the Leopold document finally released research showing that fire was a natural part of the landscape and an important process and not just a menace to suppress. In 1968, the Department of the Interior eventually adopted that policy, which led to the first Western federally supported prescribed wildfire in the Sequoia Kings National Park, which soon after then led to Sequoia Kings National Park becoming the first experimentally managed wildfire zone, where if wildfires weren't threatening human lives or structure, they'd be allowed to burn and restore this natural process to the landscape. Soon after, in 1972, the first state park supported wildfire happened nearby at Montana del Oro State Park. Um, and this led to the U.S. Forest Service eventually changing its policy from one of suppression to management. But this was a slow, with the shifting mindset, it was a slow process. And with high profile wildfires or prescribed fires escaping, there was a lot of stops and starts. And so it was still a very gradual return of fire to the landscape until recent years, where we've entered what I think is this era of good fire, where many of you in this room have probably read headlines like fighting fire with fire or fighting wildfires with good fire. California must return to prescribed burns. And this is really going back to that mindset that has a deep history in California history of using fire for a variety of reasons, including reducing fire hazard and having ecological benefits. And so I want to be clear that today I'm talking about this concept of using fire to accomplish multiple goals, such as hazard reduction and ecological benefits. I acknowledge that there's times where hazard reduction maybe is more important in areas, and it is necessary even if there is an ecological impact. And then restoring cultural burning to indigenous tribes is another important issue that is separate from what I'm talking about today. And for those of you who aren't as aware of what prescribed fire and therefore good fire might look like, I have a few videos and pictures I want to just show to familiarize you with the process. And so prescribed fire or broadcast burning is the act of coming in and intentionally setting a fire by going through an area and dropping spots of fire with trip torches. So you can see this guy up here who's walking through with a gas tank and just dropping dots of fire on the landscape, which ignites the fuel and eventually will combine into a larger flaming front. And so this is the process of how prescribed fires are often set in an area. And then what this looks like in practice on the ground, here's a time sequence of a fire I worked on down in San Diego. And you can see there's a low intensity surface fire burning through the bottom right corner. There's low fuel loads. And so it's really just a mellow surface fire. As it gets higher up onto the cliff and has more of a slope and more fuel, it starts to increase with a little bit higher flame lengths, a little faster rate of spread, getting into some of the trunks of the trees, but it's still relatively mellow. And then as a wind spike picks up, it all of a sudden starts burning a lot faster, flame lengths get a lot higher, and then the wind dies down and it starts to slow down a little bit more. And so this process of prescribed fire can be a really dynamic process due to the conditions on the ground and with the weather. And sometimes these fires can be quite drastic, especially with high fuel loads like in shrublands. We can see this fire here from a prescribed fire with the flame length significantly taller than that person in the foreground. But this isn't always this isn't necessarily a concern because there's a lot of safety precautions that are used during these events, such as most prescribed fires are the perimeter that they want to burn is outlined by what we call bare ground or a scrape line, where all the vegetation is removed. There's no fuel for that fire to carry through, and so it acts to help contain the fire. Additionally, there's people along the whole perimeter with their backs to the fire, looking outward to make sure no embers fly over and start a spot fire outside the desired burn area. A lot of resources are utilized, like these water pools and water tankers that help bring a lot of water to the landscape and allow firefighters to set up what we call hose lines so they can put out any hot spots, keep the fire contained and where they want it to burn. And then when things do get a little out of control or too hot, there's also other contingency plans like airdrops. So here's a video of a helicopter coming through, and it'll actually drop some water on a hot spot to help cool it down and keep the fire more manageable. And the safety precautions don't end with the burn ending. There's also what we call mop up, where for about 24 hours or more, there's crews on the perimeter walking through, looking for hot spots, making sure the fire doesn't flare up, using hoses and smothering them with axes if there are, and just making sure things stay contained and the fire's dying out instead of flaring back up and potentially spreading. And so now that you have an idea of what this prescribed fire looks like and how the history of fire has changed from one of abundance to slowly declining, full suppression, and then the slow reintroduction. we can start to see how there's been these ecological effects from suppressing fire for over a century. And as a result of that, we currently have what's often referred to as a wildfire problem, which is exemplified by the neighboring Gifford fire, the Canyon fire, which broke out yesterday and has been rapidly spreading, or the devastating LA fires that happened this winter, where a lot of these fires can not only have ecological consequences, but really real human consequences with loss of life, loss of homes, these long-term impacts that are really important to recognize and um, try to prevent. And the wildfire problem that we're currently facing is really characterized not necessarily by more wildfires burning, but by larger wildfires burning. And so this map of large wildfires, 5 hectare or 5,000 hectares or larger, from 1950 to 1999, shows that large wildfires did happen throughout the state of California, and they summed to burning about 7.5 million acres during this 50-year time period. In a shorter 23-year time period from 2000 to 2023, we can see that there's been a dramatic increase of large wildfires throughout the state. And as a result of that, more than twice the amount of acreage is burned in this shorter 23-year time period. And so that's really what's characterizing this wildfire problem that we're facing today. But putting this in context, if you remember, it's thought that pre-European colonization, between 5.7 to 12.4 million acres a year burned annually. And so even with this drastic increase in areas burning, we still are nowhere near what was burning pre-settlement. And that's what's sometimes referred to as this fire deficit that we need to address. But as we think about addressing this fire deficit and putting fire back on the ground, it's also important to recognize that conditions have changed since the indigenous fire era and that there's new problems and conditions that we need to face, such as the introduction of non-native species, climate change, or the consequences of more than a century of fire suppression. And so here's a picture of Yosemite Valley pre-fire suppression in 1872, and then after almost a century of fire suppression in 2020. And what are some differences that you all see? Go ahead and shout it out. So yeah, we can take colored pictures. Anything else? Hmm. Yeah, exactly. So there's much denser forest. In 1872, you see the forest, you can see the trees, but you can also see through that to the ground. By 2020, the forest has become so dense due to the lack of fire clearing out trees in the understory, you can't even see the ground. On top of that, we see some smattering of dead trees, which are drier, they're easier to ignite and carry a fire more easily. And so we can imagine how when a wildfire inevitably burns through, because one thing we've learned is we can't suppress wildfire forever. It's a matter of when, not if, an area is going to burn. It's going to burn a lot more intensely. It's going to be a lot more damaging and a lot harder to control and contain. And so something else you might have noticed in this picture is that most, if not all of these trees are conifers. And in fact, most of the research that's been done to show how we can use prescribed fire to reduce fuel loads and have both hazard reduction and ecological benefits have been on conifer forests in central and northern California. And while that's a large portion of the state and really important, all of us living here in Southern California know that California isn't homogeneous. There's a lot of other vegetation types, like the iconic oak woodlands and chaparral of Southern California. And both of these ecosystems have different conditions and problems that we need to address when we think about reinstalling fire on the landscape. And while I'd love to talk about chaparral and some of the conditions and issues we need to think about, for today's talk, I'm going to focus on the iconic oak woodlands of Southern California. And so oak woodlands cover a large part of Southern California. In Santa Barbara and Ventura County, there's a large area that has oak woodlands present and some large areas that are dominated by oak woodlands. And they extend all the way to the southern border of Mexico and more inland California. And as we think about this area that we might want to reintroduce fire and start to utilize some of the traditional ecological knowledge that indigenous tribes have to install good fire that has both hazard reduction and ecological benefits, we need to first address how conditions have changed in the system, and therefore different things might need to be addressed that weren't present during the indigenous fire era. Namely, there's been widespread fuel buildup in these areas, somewhat due to fire suppression, like in the conifer forests, but also due to widespread tree death in recent years. And so this aerial picture of an oak woodland in Southern California, you can see that there is a lot of these yellow and tan spots are dead trees in the canopy. And so they are dead, they're drying out. Again, they're easier to ignite and they carry fire more easily. And then these lighter green trees are trees that are water stressed. They're potentially on their way to dying. And even in that stress condition are also drier than healthy greener trees. And this widespread death and increasing stress of oak trees in Southern California is due to a variety of reasons. First, due to the droughts that we've had in the last decades, where especially like here at Sedgwick, where it's the southern extent of Blue Oak's range. And so on this southern extent, these oak trees are already at the limit of water stress they can handle. And so when drought comes in and dries things out further, it pushes them past the stress level that they can withstand. And so they start to die. And we're seeing this throughout California, but specifically, it's most widespread in Southern California due to that being the driest part of the state. And then we also have pests and pathogens coming through and killing these oak trees. In Southern California, starting in San Diego, there's the introduction of the invasive gold-spotted oak borer, Arizona beetle that came in and has been decimating oak populations down south. Up north, there's sudden oak death driven by the fungus Phytophthora that's also been causing widespread oak mortality. And while neither of those are in the Santa Barbara region or at Sedgwick right now, they're both expected to expand their ranges in current years due to climate change and increasing oak stress. And so getting ahead of that and understanding how fire interacts with these pests and pathogens is really important to be proactive in putting fire on the landscape in non-detrimental ways. There's also non-native annual grasses on the landscape that didn't exist in Northern Cal or in North America before European colonization. This picture of Sedgwick Reserve, you probably noticed coming in the iconic rolling yellow hills of California. Unfortunately, those are largely non-native annual grasses. Down south here, they're largely Avena and Bromus grasses, or sometimes the annual mustard forbs. And these have a lot of implications for wildfire and prescribed fire. Namely, because they're annual grasses, every March or every April or May, they die and dry out and provide more easily ignitable, flashy fuels that make the prevalence of a fire occurring much more common. And then they also produce a lot more biomass than the native annuals. And so they create a bigger fuel bed that also fuels fire more easily than native plants and can help carry fires a lot more quickly. You can imagine if a fire were to start on a hillside like this, that's just dominated by these dried, dead annual grasses, it would spread really quickly and make containing it before it hits important structures to protect a lot harder. Similarly, it makes the use of prescribed fire potentially more dangerous because it's easier for spot fires to spread outside of the desired burn perimeter, and they can come in and recolonize after a fire, preventing native species from establishing. And then lastly, the ever-present problem of modern day climate change also has widespread effects on fire throughout this country and state. Primarily in Southern California, we're dominated by a Mediterranean climate that's characterized by hot, dry summers and cool, wet winters. And the historic fire season would start in late April or early May with the ending of rains and increasing of temperatures. And so that heating up would dry out the vegetation and make it suitable to carry a fire through the landscape. That would continue and worsen throughout the summer as temperatures continued to dry up, or continued to heat up, and there was still no rain, and get the worst during late summer or early fall with these strong autumn wind events. Locally, we have sundowners that occur and cause that. Farther south, there's the Santa Ana winds. Up north, there's the foehn winds, and these are examples that they make fires easier to ignite, and then when they do ignite, they carry it at dramatic paces through the landscape. But with the traditional rainy season starting in mid to late October, vegetation would start to wet up again and be no longer suitable for carrying fire. But with climate change, we're getting an extension of this fire season on both ends. In the fall, first rains aren't occurring until now December, sometimes January. In 2018, for example, the Thomas Fire burned through in January, almost 3 months after the traditional end of the fire season due to a lack of rain. And on the other side, with rains ending sooner and temperatures being hotter, fuels drying out more quickly, and sometimes the fire season starting in sometime in March or early April. And so this extension of the fire season makes dangerous wildfires more likely, and it also makes the time period where we can have safe and controllable prescribed burns a smaller window. In addition to that, it also is making drought more common and intense, exacerbating the problem of drought, causing fuel buildup, and it favors non-native grasses in areas where canopies open up. And so it's also exacerbating the non-native grasses problem. And so we can see how these conditions have changed and require new knowledge in order to safely use prescribed fire in ways that both reduce hazard and also have ecological benefits, which gets to the crux of this question of what is good fire in Southern California oak woodlands? How do we have both of these benefits? And there's a lot of different facets to that for today's talk. And what my research is mainly focused on is facing those two problems of drought and bark beetles. As we know, climate change is going to exacerbate drought and beetles are going to expand their range. Can we use fire in a way to alleviate some of these problems, actually alleviate drought stress or reduce beetle population, or is fire only going to exacerbate them? And so first, to understand how drought specifically affects oak trees, I'm going to go through how trees move water. And so trees will move water passively through a pressure gradient that's similar to drinking water out of a straw. And so you can imagine if you have a cup of water and you're drinking out of a straw, you exert a pressure from your mouth on the tip of the straw, and that pulls water up through the straw into your mouth. Similarly, trees move water from the soil into the atmosphere by acting as that straw for the water to move through. And so this pressure gradient is increasing pressure as we go from the water in the soil into the roots, through the trunk and stem, and then out the leaf into the atmosphere. And so drought can affect this by increasing that pressure gradient both in the soil and the atmosphere. A lack of rain and therefore drying up of soil water can increase that pressure in the soil. And also with drought, we usually have hotter temperatures and a drier air, which can increase that atmospheric level at the leaf level. And so because this is a continuous pressure gradient, increasing the pressure either in the soil or the atmosphere necessitates an increase in pressure in the tree itself as well. And just like how if you suck on a straw too strongly, you can crack it and make it ineffective, if the pressure in the tree is too strong, it can actually break that water column and make that organ no longer viable for transporting water, which if it happens widespread enough through the tree, can kill the tree. And fire can interact with this in one of two ways. It's been hypothesized and shown in some systems that the burning of the understory and clearing out of the vegetation can actually increase available soil water for the tree. You imagine if you have two plants in a pot and they're both competing for water, if you take one of those plants out of the pot, the remaining plants can have more water available to it. And so sometimes it's been shown that fire can actually have that effect and alleviate some of the drought stress by removing competition for soil water. But it can also increase the atmospheric pressure, primarily during the fire. We have smoke, and with that, we have hot temperatures, increasing the atmospheric temperature and drying it out, which increases that pressure on the leaf level. And we call that a heat plume. And so that heat plume can directly damage the leaves or have downstream effects damaging the tree. And to visualize what that looks like, here's another video of a fire where we have this oak tree in the background where the tree itself isn't burning. There's no direct fire damage to it, but there's this constant smoky air going through the canopy. And we can imagine that air is probably quite hot and therefore increasing that pressure on the landscape. And so we see how fire can either increase drought stress directly by damaging the canopy or potentially alleviate some of the drought stress and have this ecological benefit. And then another issue we have in Southern California is the presence of bark beetles, like the gold-spotted oak borer beetle that's pictured here. And to understand how the gold-spotted oak beetle impacts trees, first, just a brief background on its life cycle. Adults will come in and lay their eggs in the crevices of bark. So if any of you have walked up close to a oak tree, maybe you're a tree hugger and you get a nice little hug, you've probably noticed those crevices in it. Bark isn't just this flat surface. It has these dips and crannies. And so they actually lay their eggs in those crannies. And then when they hatch and larvae come out, they actually eat their way into the tree, eating through the bark to feed and just explore and move around. And then after they pupate and become adult beetles, they then leave the tree by creating these exit holes. And so the damage that causes from the beetles can be one of two ways. And so we have a cross section of a tree right here. And what parts of this tree are the living tree? Does anyone know like what parts of the tree are living? You can go ahead and shout it out. Nice. So I was going to trick you with that one, but you all know it's just the cambium layer. And so actually a real small part of the tree is living tissue. Where other parts like the sapwood, for example, is dead tissue and what we call xylem conduits, and that's where the water transport occurs. And so one ways that beetle activity can damage trees is that some beetles actually eat a fungus that they bring with them and they cultivate inside the tree. And then as that fungus grows and spreads, it can grow into the xylem and create these physical blockages. And so just like if you pour cement down a hose, it's no longer going to pour water. This physical fungal blockage in the xylem prevents water transport and can either outright kill the tree or make it more vulnerable to future disturbance events like drought or fire. The other method that they can damage a tree through is like we saw with the gold-spotted oak borers, where they actually eat through the cambium or the phloem, which is where the carbon-rich storage happens in a tree. It's like that's their bank, that's where they store their money. And so by these beetles coming in and eating up all the stored carbon, it can make the trees, again, outright die from carbon starvation or more vulnerable to future stressors. Just like if you deplete your bank account, it's going to be hard to pay for a car repair after. And here you can see some of these streaks are through the tree. These are what we call galleries, and those are actually signs of the larva eating through the cambium and killing the tree. And again, this can interact with fire in one of two ways. There's some work down in San Diego showing how prescribed fire can actually reduce gold-spotted oak borer activity. It's shown that if the trunk of the tree heats up to hot enough temperature for long enough, it can reduce beetle emergence by up to 98%, so dramatically reduce the activity in population. But we also know that beetles are attracted to stressed trees. When trees are stressed, they release these pheromones that actually attract beetles and act as a sign that they're going to be easier to invade. There's going to be less defense compounds, and it'll be an easier food source for them. And so we can again see how fire might interact with beetle activity to reduce it and help protect the tree, or attract more beetle activity and make it more vulnerable. And so getting back to what is good fire in Southern California oak woodlands, I think two important aspects that we should consider is how fire interacts with drought and beetle activity. And so the work I've been doing out here at Sedgwick on prescribed fire is asking specifically, how does fire affect a tree's water status? And how does bark beetle activity change with fire? So getting at these two dimensions. And to do this, we had a prescribed fire that occurred this last November, November 2024, in this upper southwest 4N unit, and it burned about 15 acres. The lower southwest 4S unit is what we're using as our control site. So it's just right by, it's as close to landscape variables as possible, as similar conditions as you can get, but that don't burn. And then just for reference, the colored in section is another unit that burned the previous year, November 2023, as part of another Trex. In relation to Sedgwick, we can see where we burn and our control unit is. We're right around here. And then the colored region up there is what burned in the lake fire last summer. And so we can see that the prescribed fire that we're studying and we're looking at today is much smaller of an area that burns through during a traditional wildfire. But it's a really valuable tool for us to use to ask some of these questions and get more insight before we expand prescribed fire to larger areas of the landscape. And the fire burned through a mix of sage scrub and oak woodland grassy understory. And we can see in sage scrub, it had moderate fire intensity with somewhat large flame lengths. There was a abundance of heat plumes occurring, where here's some oak canopies that are just shrouded in an abundance of smoke, even though they're not actively burning at this time. And after the fire, most of the ground cover was burned and consumed, leaving mainly char and ash on the ground. And a lot of the oak canopies show some sign of damage, but are somewhat intact. There's healthy living parts of it. We saw very little outright oak mortality from the fire. And so with that background, getting back to the questions, first, how does fire affect a tree's water status? There's three main parts to this. First, does that damage occur? Do those heat plumes reduce water transport in the canopy? And it's been shown abundantly, and this can happen on some conifer forests during prescribed fires, but there's been no evidence of whether or not this actually happens on oak trees. And because we think of oak trees as fire resilient trees that can survive fires, resprout after fire, it's an open question of whether or not this damage actually occurs to these more resilient trees. Next, how does fire influence available soil water? And so is there that potential increase of soil water that can alleviate some drought stress? Does that occur? And then how do both of those observations combine to affect whole tree water status? And so to ask these questions, again, we worked in that upper unit using the control unit as our, or the lower unit as our control. And we quantified the heat plume by putting temperature measuring eye buttons in the canopy of trees. And so any of you with sharp eyes might be like, that's a black oak. We don't have black oaks in Sedgwick. I'm notoriously bad at taking pictures. And so this is actually a picture of a similar setup in a San Diego fire I worked on. But in the canopy, you can see these little silver specks. And so those are the temperature measuring eye buttons that we wrap in foil just to protect them from any smoke damage. And they log a time series of temperature during the fire. So we can actually see directly what temperatures reached during the fire. And we saw that the heat plume varied dramatically, both across the fire and even within a canopy. So here's two time sequences from the same tree at different points in the canopy. And you can see that the maximum temperature varies by over 20 degrees Celsius. With the left tree, or the left sensor being in a part of the canopy that had an understory of sage scrub, burning much hotter, reaching almost 80 degrees Celsius at its maximum temperature. In the right sensor, under a more grassy understory, having much more mild heat conditions in the canopy. And so we have a variety of heat plumes where we can actually see differences in damage due to that. Then, yeah, ambient temperature was around like, these trees mainly burn in the morning, so it was around like 18 to 20 Celsius. Yeah. And so then to measure transport efficiency, if you remember that trees move water through this pressure gradient, we can actually measure how efficient they're moving water by looking at water flow over different pressure gradients. And just like how you can imagine, like with a bigger straw, it might be easier to pull water through. You can move the same amount of water with less force from your mouth, where a really small straw is going to be a lot harder to move water through very fast. So we can actually measure that efficiency in the tree, and reductions of that efficiency are indicative of damage. And so to do that, we bring leaves and branches back to the lab and use this very fun setup where we have a computer that is hooked up to a scale. On the scale, we have a basin of water that is connected to leaves and stems through tubing. And then the leaf and stems are placed in this chamber that is completely airtight and connected to a vacuum. And then we turn the vacuum on and pull water through the leaves and stems at different pressures. So we create our own pressure gradients and measure the water flow to then look at how efficiently they're moving water. And it's plant physiologists are kind of crazy. And so there's a lot of like very specific precautions and nuances you have to do with the technique. And so it's really fun to, after collecting samples in the field, spend like 12 hours straight in the lab doing this, because you also have to measure the samples you collect in under 24 hours so they're not exposed to post-collection damage. But it's a really informative technique. Then to measure the soil water, we again can think about this pressure gradient moving through the tree. And during the day when the trees are active, they're actively moving water to photosynthesize, we have this gradient. But at night, when the trees are shutting down, they're not moving water. You can think of them as sleeping. They actually slowly come into equilibrium with the soil. And around 2 or 3 a.m., they actually have the same pressure, water pressure in the leaf than they have in the soil. And so we can go out at 3 a.m. and use the tree as a soil moisture meter and tell us exactly what the water conditions directly where the tree's rooted is. And we do this by collecting these leaves at night and then putting them in a pressure chamber that we then close and slowly pressurize with nitrogen. And we look at the leaf stem under a microscope, and when we see water start to come up, we know that's the pressure that we're opposing to get water moving through the leaf. And so that's the pressure gradient that the soil is at. So here's a picture of us post pre-dawns hiking back out of the site around 6 a.m. to go measure those samples after collecting them. And then lastly, to measure whole tree efficiency, we can again, just like we measured that leaf and stem tissue in the lab, we can actually measure this on trees in the field where the pre-dawn measurements at the soil are one end of the gradient, midday measurements of the leaf are the other end, giving us that pressure gradient. And then we can go out and use a fancy machine that actually clamps onto a leaf and measures the amount of water leaving a leaf. And so that's the water flow. So we can then calculate how efficient a tree is moving water at a given point in time. And so now that you have that background that was hopefully not too tedious to listen to and had some hopefully fun pictures to get you through it, we can actually start to answer some of these questions. First, how do heat plumes reduce water transport? And so I'm going to show you a graph where on the x-axis is the measured temperature. So all of those sensors were attached to a branch from the tree and they measured maximum temperature that's going to be represented by the x-axis. And then the y-axis are those efficiency values that we measured on leaves in the lab, with larger values being more efficient or indicating less to no damage, and smaller values being less efficient, indicating some amount of damage to the tissue. And I'm going to show you a scatter plot where each dot represents a paired leaf measurement with temperature and the canopy measurement, and then a general trend line showing what relationship occurs. And so we can see that there's a significant relationship where as temperatures in the canopy increase, the efficiency of these leaves decrease. And so this is a sign that there is some damage occurring to the leaves during the fire, reducing their transport efficiency, potentially making them more vulnerable to drought stress. And there's even a few instances where we have values close to or at zero, indicating complete damage and disruption of that water transport column, essentially killing these leaves. We also measured this on the stems that those leaves were connected to, and there was no relationship to temperature. So instead of showing you temperature on the x-axis, I'm showing you 3 time points where we have our unburned trees that never burned, branch samples that we took the day after the fire, and then branch samples on the same trees we took a week after the fire. And then on the y-axis is that same measurement, but on the stems. So again, larger values mean more efficiency, less damage. Smaller values mean less efficiency, more damage. And what we see is that immediately after the fire, there's no difference between the unburned and burned trees. And so there's no sign of direct damage due to the fire. But when we come back a week later, we do see significantly lower efficiency in the stems. And so this reduction of water transport and potential damage to the stems. And so this hints at, even though there's no direct damage to the stem water movement due to the fire, there's this delayed damage that I think is what happening is that the damage to the leaves is slowly having downstream effects and expanding to then eventually reach the stems after a longer time period. But these were all on very specific small sections of the tree. And so it was very localized effects. And we saw very few instances of the whole tree canopy being burned and showing signs of this damage. And so I think a next step is really looking at the long-term effects and how long-lasting this damage is. And so I've started going back out, taking samples and remeasuring it, and I'm going to continue that through the summer to see if the damage persists and if so, for how long. And just to kind of give some insight to that, here's a tree that burned in the fire, and this is a picture I took last month in July. And you can see there's portions of the canopy that are scorched. They're pretty much dead. Those leaves aren't active. They're not moving water. They're not photosynthesizing. They're not contributing anything to the tree. But there's a larger part of the canopy up top that's still green. It looks happy and healthy. And when we take measurements on it, there's no sign that it's any different from unburned healthy trees. And then on top of that, the quality's a little hard to see, but you maybe see these green patches in here. That's actually resprouts. And so the burned branches that have dead leaves are having new branches emerge that have healthy green leaves. And so there's a lot of interesting dynamics happening here that hint at potential long-term effects that are important to observe as we start to think about these damages. And so we do see that there's some level of localized damage to the trees from the fire. But what about the flip side? Is there a benefit from the fire to the tree? How does it influence that available soil water? And so this is, again, remember, this is those pre-dawn measurements. We're using the tree itself to tell us what water stress it's experiencing in the soil. And so the x-axis is, again, our burn and unburned trees before the burn, just a few weeks before the burn in November, and then post-burn about a month ago in mid-July. And then the y-axis is our water potential. And so this is the actual pressure value that we're measuring from the leaves, where larger values indicate higher water stress and less available water in the soil, and smaller values indicate more water stress and less available water in the soil. And what we see is before the fire occurred, there was no difference in our trees. And so this is good for future interpretation because it shows that the trees are in similar conditions. So any difference that we might see after the fire is likely to be due to the fire and not due to site or seasonal differences. And so looking at this after the fire, we see that there is a significant difference. with our burn trees actually having lower water potentials and therefore indicating they're less water stressed. They have access to more soil water than the unburned trees do. And so this is potentially that good fire side of it, where they're potentially alleviating drought stress. It's important to note to that this fire occurred after 2 very wet years. So we're seeing a benefit of trees that probably weren't that stressed before the fire. Whether or not this is a tool when the trees are already in drought stress might require more work to see if there's a benefit or compounding effect with that drought. And so we see that there's both damage to the tree, but it's localized, and there's also a benefit of clearing out the understory, making more water available. So what does that affect on the whole tree? How do those add up together? And so this is that whole tree measurement where we use the pre-dawn and midday measurements in addition to the sensor telling us how much water is leaving the leaf. And again, it's just a bigger version of the previous values we looked at. And so higher values are higher efficiency, healthier, less damaged trees. Lower values are less efficiency, more damaged trees. And again, we're just looking at our burned and unburned trees. And we can see that there's no significant difference. The burned trees have less distribution of values, but overall the values are similar. There's no difference in tree efficiency moving water. And so this indicates that maybe those two, the negative impact and the positive impact, are negating themselves and balancing out to lead to no real long-term water damage to the tree. But it's also important to note that we're not in the peak summer yet. We're not at the peak of their water stress. And so some next steps on this are to continue monitoring through the summer and next year to look at the longevity of any effects that we see. Keep measuring specifically during the worst of the summer to see if either the damage or the benefit gets amplified under higher water stress. And then work in some carbon effects, like looking at how photosynthesis and carbon storage changes due to the fire, because that's another side of the story that affects tree health and whether or not the fire is beneficial or harmful to future disturbance events. And so as we start to define what good fire might look like in this system, we can see that there are some benefits to prescribed fire for oaks. They can reduce the water stress, and that any damage that occurs is mainly local and doesn't seem to have whole tree effects about 8 months later. But there's also some potential risks. There is damage to the canopy, and the long-term implications are unknown, especially under other conditions like during a peak drought. And so we've started to answer how fire might be beneficial or harmful under water stress in these systems. And so we can now look at how bark beetle activity changes. And for this, we asked two main questions of one, how does fire influence beetle activity in tree health? And so remember, some research down south has shown that fire can actually reduce beetle activity by killing them. So do we see that benefit? And then how does fire influence beetle populations? And so does it kill beetles and decrease population? Or by stressing out trees, and does it actually attract beetles and lead to a higher population in the fire? And I want to shout out the work I'll be showing you here has been primarily work by an amazing recent graduate, Brooke Ryan, who's actually here in the audience. And she did a lot of this work as part of her senior thesis. And so much of the data I'll be showing you today is due to her hard work and intelligence. And on top of the funding we had, she also obtained an undergraduate research creative award from UCSB and then the UC NRS Matthias Award to support further research this summer so we can dive into more of the dynamics. And so to measure tree health, Brooke went through and she did categorical health measurements of trees, ranking them as either excellent health, good health, like shown here, fair health, or poor health, like on the right. And you might be like, that tree's not poor, it's dead. But there's actually smaller resprouts popping up that show it's still alive. So we rank it as not dead, but poor. And we hope that it'll continue to recover. She also measured beetle activity, primarily through counting the amount of boreholes present. So remember, when beetles emerge from the tree, they leave this exit hole that you can see, a variety of them here on these trees. And that's a good sign that beetles are active, they're present, the larva ate through the tree, reached maturity, and has left the tree. And then the measure of beetle population, in late May, we went and actually set out a number of beetle traps, which have a pheromone inside that attract the beetles. They fly in, they get trapped, they can't escape, and they eventually fall down into a collection basin in the bottom. And then we would come out every 2 weeks and just count the number of beetles that are there. And that gives us some insight into the population dynamics. So with those methods, we can start to answer some of these questions. First, How does the fire influence activity and health? First, looking at health immediately after the fire, about a week or two after the fire, we can look at the distribution of trees in our different categories, ranking from excellent to poor, where the y-axis is the percent of trees. So for example, if the good column had a 30% of burned trees, that means 30% of the trees that burned were in the good health category. And similarly for the unburned trees. And then I'm just going to show you a bar graph that shows just the overall count. And so what we see is that there is a significant difference in distributions, with burned trees having lower health and unburned trees having higher health. And the only trees that we observed in the poor health category were actually in the burned perimeter, and the only trees we observed in the excellent health category were in the unburned perimeter. So it does look like there's an effect of fire that's immediately after the fire, lowering tree health. Furthermore, if we then look at beetle activity, looked at a categorical range of borehole amounts on the trees, and then again, just percent trees on the y-axis, we again see a significant difference with burned trees having more beetle activity than the unburned trees. One caveat for this, though, is that we weren't able to get pre-fire data for this project due to logistical constraints. We couldn't start until after the fire. And so we can't say for sure whether or not this is directly due to the fire, especially because it's so soon after the fire, or if there's just differences in beetle health and activity before the fire between these two sites. But to start to answer that, we can look at long-term dynamics and how the trees recover and beetle activity changes over time. And so to do that, Brooke's been continually surveying the trees every once a month. And so another time point in late June, looking at health again, we see that while there's still a significant difference in distribution with burn trees having lower health, they're starting to recover. There's less of a difference between the two groups. And indeed, there's actually no trees that are still in the poor health category. So we see that these trees are recovering in health. So that's a good sign that there isn't this long-term damage. Additionally, looking at beetle activity, we see a similar trend of there's still higher beetle activity in the burned trees, but the difference is getting smaller. And so this again hints at maybe the large difference we saw initially was not due to the fire, it was just due to pre-fire dynamics. Or if it was due to the fire, that effect isn't long lasting and in about 6 to 8 months is already starting to diminish. And so we see that there's mixed results for fire influencing beetle activity, but the overall impact on health seems to be that the trees continue to recover after the fire. And so what about beetle populations? And so to do that, we can just look at the trap counts that we got every 2 weeks from sampling the traps. And so this is going to be, again, another scatter plot where each point is an individual trap on a given date, and then 2 trend lines representing the burned trees in red and the unburned trees in blue. And what we see is while there's no significant difference between the two sites, we're consistently getting more beetles in the burn site. And over time, as the life history of the beetles is changing, overall population counts are decreasing. And so this is another sign that there might be an effect of fire on beetle population. And part of this might just be putting out traps is expensive and hard. And so we were only able to do 6 total. Or it might be that the impact on the population is small. And so it's not a large scale effect on the trees. And we're also getting a diversity of beetles. We're not just getting one type of beetle. A few examples are the Western oak bark beetle, which for some reason I think is incredibly cute. The auger powder post beetle, and then other beetles that we've yet to identify, but Brooke's hard at work taking pictures with the microscope, keying them out, sending them to experts trying to identify. And so the next steps for this project are to continue monitoring to see how these trends continue to persist going into the worst of the summer and then the following winter. Continue identifying captured beetles and see if there's any interesting differences in different species or families. Test for more direct effects of the activity on the tree through different plant physiology measurements. And then hopefully expand the new fires. Like there might be another prescribed fire on Sedgwick this November. And if so, it'd be great to actually get pre-fire data and do a more robust study to better pin down how this affects these dynamics. And so again, as we start to define what good fire might look like from a bark beetle aspect at Sedgwick, we don't really see any good effects, but we see some neutral effects that might mean that prescribed fire in these systems is okay and it's not going to have large-scale ecological damage. And namely that there isn't really a clear direct effect, and so it might be kind of a neutral process with beetle activity, and that any initial decrease in health does seem to be recovering. But there's also some potential risks, namely that there might be a population increase, and it does seem like there's an increase in activity. And better pinning down the effect of fire on this and having a deeper understanding is especially important as we expect the potential for more damaging and deadly beetles to expand into our range, like the gold-spotted oak borer. And so that was hopefully a digestible insight into some data that starts to answer the question of what the good fire might look like in Southern California oaks. And so I'll wrap up with just a few key takeaways that I hope you took from this talk. First, that human started fires has a long, deep, rich history in California, where it's been abundant throughout the landscape for much of California's history and has only diminished in recent years. That reintroducing fire to the landscape is really important because of the effects that fire suppression has had throughout California and how it's helped kindle part of the problem that we have currently with wildfires. But as we start to reintroduce fire and we look to indigenous knowledge to help guide us, it's also important to acknowledge that conditions have changed. And so there's new considerations like invasive species, climate change, fuel buildup that we need to address and get new knowledge on before we can do this at large scales. And that when we define good fire on the landscape, that there's really a hazard reduction and ecological component. We don't want to just burn all of California's oak woodlands and lose this beautiful, valuable system in order to protect all structures. But sometimes it is important to protect structures, and so that's also an important component to think about. And that good fires in oak woodlands is complicated. The two dimensions might be their ability to reduce water stress and reduce, or at the very least, not increase beetle activity. And before we implement this fire on a large scale throughout all of California, it's really important to define this because we have a lot of other threats to these systems like drought, climate change, human development, non-native species. And all of you are out here today at Sedgwick. You hopefully walked around. I'm sure you all appreciate these natural ecosystems that we have. And so conserving them and protecting them is really important as we keep moving forward with this, with these programs. And so with that, I'll end the talk and open it up to any questions. Yeah, and
Yeah, thank you for that. That was really interesting. I'm Jane Paul from our librarian at CSB. So I have two things. First of all, I think the Beatles cute too.
Yeah.
No photo.
Yeah.
And secondly, before the introduction of the non-native annual grasses, what would our local hillsides look like? Are they still being golden in the summer and the fall?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's actually the short answer is we don't know very well. There is a lot of debate about what native grasslands or forelands looked like pre-colonization. The best we can tell, we know there's some species like native bunch grasses, stipa, that were probably pretty common and are one of the most common restoration species we use now. We do see parts of California that are naturally like golden from poppies or purple from lupins, and those are fire lupins, or some lupins can be fire followers. Those are native forbs that come out after wet seasons. And so there probably was a good amount of coloring across the landscape, or like when we see super blooms, those are probably species that are more common throughout California. But we don't know for sure or definitively what the different compositions or native diversity was because we've lost a lot of it, and it's really hard to remake that diversity. Yeah. Yeah.
On the bark beetles, the life cycle,
Mhm.
are you just trapping them pre and post burn area or throughout the season? Because there is.
Mhm. Yeah, so totally. So that's a great question. And so we started trapping in May due to funding not coming through to buy the traps until then. And then we had to order it internationally. And so it took a while to get that purchase order and get it here. And so we didn't start till May, which is a little later than we wanted to. But then we set 3 traps in the burn unit and 3 traps in the neighboring unburned area. So we're looking at 2 different sites that had different fire conditions. And we're hoping to keep collecting them. We expect the activity to really die out pretty soon here as the adults enter more of a dormant stage. But then maybe some of the beetles have a second life stage, and then others will become active again next spring. And so hopefully if I can have the persistence that Brooke has had after she leaves, we'll keep monitoring it and get more long-term trends on that. But yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah.
Are you evaluating just single species?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question and something I meant to mention overlooked. And so for the talk today, I only was looking at coast live oaks, but I'm also collecting data on blue oaks and I'm hoping to include that in the findings moving forward. And so we're looking the main oak species at Sedgwick are the coast lives, the blues, and valley oaks. There's almost no valley oaks in the burn perimeter. And so because of that, we're really just focusing on the two oaks that are present. Yeah, thank you. Mhm. Yeah.
You know, in such a context for everything, thinking on a landscape scale and with your technology with this.
Mhm.
So, if there's more water in the air.
Yeah.
Then that would affect the spot as well.
Totally.
So does that give like the oaks that are closer to the coast with more water in the air a better chance? You know, if you think of like all of California, maybe in coastal, or maybe in places where they were
Yeah.
state.
Totally. Yeah, that's a really good question. And the short answer is yes, that does make a difference. Both maybe more intuitively, like trees that are rooted at the bottom, like in a basin or next to a watershed, are going to have access to more trees, but also that airflow. And in fact, in some of these pre-dawn samplings, even just driving like through Sedgwick in the morning in the Kubota, which is open air, we go through dramatic temperature changes at 4 in the morning, where we go from like it being freezing cold to like somewhat warm. And we do see some effect of that on the measured values, especially during the day. And there's a lot of different variables affecting it, so it's hard to pinpoint exactly. But there's been some really cool work happening out of some labs that have shown the effect of vapor pressure deficit. So how like hot and dry the air is, that really drives that water potential or leaf level stress and subsequent water flow. And so I think that moving forward, there definitely is a way to think about that both on the micro scale and the larger scale, but we're not quite there yet with our knowledge. And there's some other folks like Max Moritz has been championing this for a while and trying to get me to take on as a side project to actually look at foliar uptake from fog. So in the summer, when we have fog on the coastal zones, or even here we get fog sometimes, can the leaves actually take that up and use it for water? And we suspect that it does because when we measure that pre-dawn value, if there's fog, we get really funky values because we think that fog is really essentially throwing the tree out of equilibrium because there's potentially more water available to the leaf than in the roots. And so yeah, I think as we get more knowledge, that's something that could be really informative. Tom?
So following from Ryan's question there, so you've got thermal and essentially temperature things and drying.
Mhm.
But what about wind? How does that come into evaporative demand?
Mhm.
And does it sometimes override?
Yeah, that's also another really good question. And the short answer is a scientist's favorite. It's complicated. Um, But essentially, it can override it under certain conditions. We know that wind can cause higher evaporative demand in the leaf level and increase water stress. Leaves actually have this really unique, sorry, this is a little technical, but leaves have this really unique, it's called a boundary layer, and they impose this almost like artificial atmosphere around the leaf on a micro scale that protects it from the worst conditions in the atmosphere. And the wind can actually blow through and get rid of that boundary layer, opening them up to more pressure in the atmosphere. And so it can. And part of the complexity with that question is that we don't fully understand under what conditions temperature is more damaging or stressful to a tree versus water. And there's evidence that stomata open and close on a leaf, they can actually control conditions somewhat to either thermoregulate or try to reduce that water demand, but we don't know when or why one or the other might occur. And we're starting to look at that. both on the adult oak trees. I'm going to be collecting some data this summer to try to look at the nuances between temperature avoidance and water stress avoidance, but also in seedlings. And so for those of you who read the flyer, you might have noticed that they mentioned work on seedlings, and I didn't talk about seedlings today. As I put this talk together, it just got too long, and I didn't want to put so much data for you. But we are also working with oak seedlings, and we're looking at some really exciting data that's trying to look at both leaf temperatures and thermal regulation and water stress, and looking at if leaf stomata, which is where photosynthesis and water transfer occurs, preferentially favors water protection or temperature protection. And so hopefully with that, we can start to understand that a little bit more. Yeah.
Big pumpkin. And then, of course, now I'm gonna start introducing other variables,
Yeah.
but I think it would be really helpful for other, like land managers, you know, what the soil, what the fire severity was, and then measuring it from your prescriber. So we're using those methods that are used often to figure out soil severity. Heat output, then, we could go across, because from your picture, this is a very light. And I don't want your results taken out of context. It can be.
Totally.
One of the things about the large wildfires that are happening now is also that there is an amazing amount of soil damage. So, and if you wanted to look at that, you could just increase the residence.
Yeah.
Of your fire in a certain spot, you know, just
Yeah.
put a pilot.
Yeah.
But I mean, but then if you at least report it, people might not use your results for the wrong reason.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a really important aspect. And there's a lot more research happening on these fires than I showed today. And so Frank Davis, the one of the head researchers here and part of the LeCret Center, him and his colleagues are actually, they've done a lot of the work documenting the post-fire severity and the soil damages, the fuel consumption, the direct like char on the trees. So we do have that data. And for a final report, we're hoping to synthesize all of that together. Additionally, that question of, you're right, this was a relatively mild prescribed fire. There were pockets with sage scrub understory that actually got pretty hot, completely ashed, and show signs of more moderate to severe fire severity. And so we will have part of that, but also some future research that I'm really excited about is we're working on doing much smaller scale, maybe even like individual tree burning, so we can replicate it better and do fuel addition or removal to get at that severity context in more detail. So those are all really important points that we're hoping to capture with nuance moving forward. Yeah.
And I'll talk to you later.
Yeah.
Here's
Mm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I know there's a lot of work happening down south and then some here too. But I'd love to talk to you about that. In the back, Eric.
Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm.
Prescribing.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, so that's a really good question. And not in the oak woodlands part of the perimeter, but in the shrub part of the perimeter. Frank actually, he did put some temperature probes in the soil to measure the temperature profiles. And one thing that Frank's also done in the past on really high intensity chaparral fires is measured soil profile temperature profiles. And one thing we've learned from that is that soil is an incredible insulator. In fact, like when I put out temperature sensors to measure temperature like lower down on the tree, I just bury my data loggers like maybe 10 centimeters and they're totally fine. And so it's really hard to heat up soil to really hot temperatures. And not only does it take really high fire temperatures, but it takes really long residence times that don't often occur except for in like really big fuel loads like the chaparral, if there's a payload like a fallen trunk. And so generally speaking, the soil temperatures don't heat up that much. Even in a wildfire, when it's moving through, we don't expect it to heat up too much. It's hard to say for sure because we don't know where wildfires are going to occur, so we can't actually measure it. But yeah, we do know that soil is a really good insulator. And oftentimes when surface temperatures are reaching in the hundreds of degrees, we don't get above like maybe 30 degrees in the topsoil. And so it takes a lot to heat up the soil. Yeah. Carlos, hand, you've been out for a while. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Drawing of the atmosphere
Mm-hmm.
and out on your side.
Mhm.
So if you see that same kind of behavior in the regrowing leaves on the trees, are they bigger or flat?
That's a really good question. And we do see different leaf morphology, specifically on the resprouts. Those generally have bigger, flatter leaves. There's other work on other species that show that resprouts in general are generally like less water safe. They're more productive with photosynthesis because they need to start assimilating more carbon. But it's a little tricky to tell for sure because there's a lot of morphology differences even within a tree. Like when we collect leaves to measure things like leaf area to sapwood area or water potential, leaves that are collected that are sun exposed versus shade exposed from the same tree can vary dramatically. And so quantifying the differences due to the fire gets really hard because how do you standardize within one tree? Yeah.
You mentioned that some of the trees don't die
Mhm.
when the fire goes through, but that was. Could you have gone through before the fire
Mhm.
and picked out the trees that died? Do you think there's obvious characteristics that say this tree's in bad shape, it has a lot of beetles? And
Mhm.
the reason I asked it is that maybe that's feedback part of the good fire, but it
Mhm.
actually takes out the trees that are getting more of the population.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really astute question. And indeed, that's one of the proposed benefits of fire is preventing that overcrowding, getting rid of those dying trees, making room for the younger trees. And I think there's some trees that we could pick out beforehand that are very obviously on their way out. But it's complicated by some of those trees, they just don't burn that hot, so they survive. And then other trees, for like those of you that have been hiking around oak woodlands in the recent years, oaks just they look really healthy one day, and the next day half of that tree just dies, or they split and there's root rot. And so there's also some oak trees that, for all you can tell, look really healthy, and then they just kick it. And so you could definitely couldn't pick out every tree, but there's some that are obviously on their way out.
To follow up on that, you think that influence some of the result on the back end, the only tree that survive, the ones that are most suited to survive.
Mhm.
With those characteristics.
Potentially partially because we can only measure these things on living trees, but also the mortality was really small. Like none of our study trees that we selected before the fire died. And then hiking through the perimeter, I'd say definitely less than 10%, probably less than 5% of the oak trees died. And so I feel pretty confident that maybe we're not representing those small number of trees that are going to die, but for the most part, we're representing what's normal in these trees. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'd like to ask you for some speculation.
Yeah.
If you don't mind. So if I probably noted that they call oak trees timber garden, because they watch fire, power embers on them, and the embers. Um.
Yeah.
Just speculation wise, I mean.
Yeah, I think there's a few different parts of that. So one, because coast lives are evergreen, their leaves have higher moisture quality than some other trees, or moisture content, sorry, and they're thicker leaves, and so it's just like how starting a campfire, you can't start with the big logs, you have to start with small kindling and build up. That the tissue on coast live oaks are a little bigger tissue that are harder to ignite from a smaller ember or fire. So that's probably part of it. The other part is that oak woodlands in general, they generally burn either surface fires or what we call passive crown fires, where the fire might reach up into the canopy, but it doesn't normally spread. Versus like in dense conifer forests, they can burn in active crown fires, where once the fire reaches the canopy, it can spread from tree to tree. And part of that is because the oak canopies are somewhat dispersed. They're not really dense. There's a lot of space in between leaves. And so even if a certain section of the canopy does ignite from the ember, it's not likely to carry through the canopy on its own. So that's also part of it. One caveat to that, though, is 2 years ago when we were doing a prescribed fire down here, there's a lot of lichen on these trees, and it was a dry day where the lichen was really dry, and we actually saw that the lichen ignited in a very flashy way. It made these like ember waterfalls and actually helped spread the fire outside of where it was actively burning. And so I think there definitely is a role for these coast live oaks to be ember screens, but you also want to be aware of like lichen presence and other things that might influence their effectiveness of that. I mean, in coastal Santa Barbara, no, because lichens are extremely responsive to the atmosphere, and where you have a lot of fog, and moisture, it's not out here. Not don't cut down the trees, don't cut down the lichen. Maybe in the peak fire season, similar to how you limb trees to have a certain like spacing from your house, that could be part of your fire safe zones. But I think all native species have value, and so like don't just go out and take away all the lichen. Yeah. hmm hmm But we don't have it here. It's spreading north. It's definitely it's gone up to about Malibu, maybe higher now. And so it'll unfortunately probably get here eventually. But we don't have it yet. Yeah. Great. Well, thanks everyone for coming and listening. Really appreciate it.